Hey there. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be taking a look back at a pretty dark chapter in
Mhm.
American history,
Okay.
the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana during the 1920s.
All right.
And you might be thinking, okay, but why should I care
Yeah.
about something that happened a century ago?
Right.
Well, the thing is, the story of the Klan in Indiana isn't just some dusty history lesson. It actually offers some really unsettling parallels to things happening
Ah,
in our world today.
absolutely.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating about this topic is that the Klan's strongest base wasn't where you might expect. It wasn't in the Old South,
Good.
but right here in the heartland in Indiana.
Wow.
And that fact alone makes you question a lot of assumptions
Mm.
about American history and identity.
Exactly. So we've got two main sources for this deep dive. First, we have a New Yorker article that gives a really gripping overview of the Klan's rise and fall in Indiana, focusing on this larger-than-life figure named D.C. Stephenson.
Okay.
And then we've also got this academic paper
Mm.
that delves into their own newspaper, the Fiery Cross.
That newspaper is a gold mine of information. It lets us peek right inside the Klan's worldview, see how they justified their actions, and understand the tactics they used to gain power.
So our mission today is to unpack all of this. We're going to figure out how a hate group managed to gain so much power, what their motives were, and most importantly, what lessons we can learn from this dark chapter in American history.
It's about understanding how something so seemingly distant can actually resonate so strongly with the world we live in now.
You know, it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking about the KKK as something from a bygone era, like, oh, that's not us anymore. We've moved past that as a society.
Sure.
But history has a funny way of repeating itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And one thing that studying history teaches us is that societal trends, even the really ugly ones, they have a way of reemerging if the conditions are right.
And that's what makes this whole thing about the Klan in Indiana
Right.
so unsettling, right? Because it happened in the heartland. It happened in a place we tend to associate with traditional values and a sense of unity.
Exactly. And think about the context of the 1920s. America was going through this period of massive social and economic upheaval. There was a huge influx of immigrants, shifting gender roles, a lot of technological advancement. All of this created a climate of anxiety and uncertainty, which groups like the KKK were able to exploit.
So let's talk about this D.C. Stephenson guy.
Yeah.
The New Yorker article describes him as a total con man, but a really charismatic one,
Yeah.
which I guess is how he became the grand dragon of the Indiana Klan.
Yeah.
Essentially, he was running the state from behind the scenes, right?
More than behind the scenes, really. Stevenson had judges, police, even politicians in his pocket.
Wow.
He had his own private army. He literally said at one point, "I am the law," which is just chilling when you think about it.
Wait, hold on. He actually said, I am the law.
He did, and that's a perfect example of how the Klan twisted the idea of American values to their own ends. Here you have a guy who claims to be upholding Americanism while simultaneously terrorizing entire communities.
It's just mind-blowing. And the New Yorker article really lays out who these targets were. Black Americans, immigrants, of course, Catholics, Jews. It's like anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of what it meant to be American was fair game.
And that's a crucial point. The Klan's ideology was built on this idea of true Americans versus everyone else. They created this narrative of themselves as victims, as protectors of a way of life that was under threat.
And that's where their newspaper, the Fiery Cross, comes in. It's like they were building their own media ecosystem, right?
Exactly. Think of it as the 1920s version of social media. They used the Fiery Cross to spread their propaganda, control the narrative, and recruit new members.
And what's crazy is that a lot of their messaging, the way they framed things, it's almost like looking at some of the stuff you see online today.
Yeah.
Like they constantly pushed this narrative that they were the victims,
Yeah.
that true Americans were being silenced and marginalized.
And they did this through really sophisticated propaganda techniques. The academic paper we have points out how the Fiery Cross would constantly distort historical facts, twist religious teachings, and use fear-mongering language to demonize their opponents.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to today's world a little more clearly.
Think about it. They were masters of creating this alternate reality,
Right.
where they were the heroes and everyone else was the enemy. And that's a tactic that's still very much in play today.
So, in a sense, the Fiery Cross was like their own version of a social media feed.
Absolutely. It was their way of bypassing traditional media and going directly to their target audience
Yeah.
with their message of hate and fear. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just about spreading hateful rhetoric. They were actively working to infiltrate and influence institutions,
Right.
particularly churches.
Oh, right. The New Yorker article mentions how the Klan used Protestant churches as recruiting grounds.
Exactly. They tapped into this existing network of religious communities, framing themselves as defenders of traditional Protestant morality.
Right.
It's a fascinating parallel to how certain political figures today have cultivated support among some evangelical groups.
You're talking about Trump, right? I mean, the article doesn't mention him directly, but it's hard not to see the similarities.
Right.
Both the Klan and, well, certain modern political movements have tapped into this sense of religious identity, this idea that their values are under attack.
It's a very effective tactic. By aligning themselves with religious groups, they gain a sense of legitimacy and authority, and it allows them to frame their political agenda in moral terms, which can be very persuasive to people who are already predisposed to agree with them.
That makes a lot of sense. But going back to the Fiery Cross,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the kind of specific content they were publishing. What kind of arguments were they making? What kind of stories were they telling?
Well, one of the things that really stands out in the academic papers analysis is how they would constantly use warped historical comparisons to justify their actions. Like they compare themselves to the founding fathers, claiming they were fighting for the same principles of liberty and freedom.
Wait, seriously? They actually compared themselves to the founding fathers.
Yeah.
That's pretty outrageous.
It is. But it also reveals something important about their strategy. They were trying to tap into this deep well of American patriotism to make it seem like their hateful ideology was somehow aligned with the nation's founding ideals.
So it was all about manipulating
Yeah.
people's sense of history and identity.
Precisely. And they also used the Fiery Cross to spread rumors and conspiracy theories about their enemies. They would accuse Black people of being criminals, immigrants of stealing jobs, Catholics of being un-American, and so on.
It's just classic fear-mongering, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's a tactic that's unfortunately still very effective today.
You know, it's interesting because the more we talk about the Fiery Cross, the more I'm seeing how it functions like a 1920s prototype for social media. They were using it to build community,
Right.
spread propaganda, and mobilize their base.
That's a really insightful observation. And just like social media today, the Fiery Cross played a key role in creating echo chambers, where people were only exposed to information that confirmed their existing beliefs.
Which makes it even harder to challenge those beliefs, right?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics,
Yeah.
both then and now.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Klan's rise to power, their ideology, and their propaganda machine. But what about their downfall? How did they eventually lose their grip on Indiana?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And it all comes back to D.C. Stephenson, the Grand Dragon himself.
The New Yorker article really gets into the details of his downfall, doesn't it?
It does. And what's fascinating is that it wasn't some grand moral awakening or a popular uprising that brought him down. It was his own horrific actions.
Right. The article talks about the Madge Oberholzer case.
Yes. In 1925, Stephenson kidnapped, brutally assaulted, and ultimately caused the death of a young woman named Madge Oberholzer. The details are incredibly disturbing. He bit her so severely that she developed infections, and she later took poison
Oh my gosh.
in a desperate attempt to escape the situation.
That's just horrifying.
It is. And what's crucial is that Oberholzer lived long enough to give a statement to the authorities about what had happened. Her testimony, along with other evidence of Stephenson's corruption and criminal activities, led to his arrest and conviction.
So it was his own depravity that finally exposed the true nature of the Klan.
And led to its downfall.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that even after Stephenson's conviction and the Klan's decline in Indiana, the underlying prejudices and societal anxieties that allowed them to flourish in the first place didn't just disappear.
That's a sobering thought. So if the Klan's downfall wasn't really about a change of heart in society, what does that tell us about the possibility of similar movements gaining power today? Well, it's a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. Just because a hate group fades from prominence doesn't mean the ideas they spread have vanished. Those ideas can linger and resurface under the right conditions.
And given what we've been talking about, the parallels between the Fiery Cross and today's social media, the way certain groups exploit religious anxieties, it seems like those conditions might be more present than ever.
That's a valid concern. But history also offers us hope. It shows us that even the most powerful and entrenched hate groups can be challenged and defeated. But it takes awareness, vigilance, and a willingness to speak out against injustice, wherever we see it.
So what can we do? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, right? Like, how do you even begin to combat these deeply rooted prejudices and the ways they're being amplified in our current media landscape?
It's a complex issue, no doubt. But I think the first step is education. Understanding the history of groups like the Klan, how they operated, the tactics they used. It's crucial to recognizing similar patterns today.
So basically, we need to be more aware of how history can repeat itself, even if it doesn't wear the same costumes.
Exactly. And that awareness has to translate into action. We need to be willing to speak out against hate and intolerance wherever we see it, whether it's online, in our communities, or even within our own families.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but sometimes change starts with those smaller conversations, challenging those casual comments or jokes that perpetuate prejudice.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to support organizations and initiatives that are working to combat hate and promote understanding.
Right, because this isn't something any one person can solve on their own. It takes collective effort.
It does. And I think it's also crucial to be mindful of our own biases. We all have them, and it's important to examine them critically and to be open to perspectives that challenge our own.
You know, thinking back to D.C. Stephenson and his downfall, it makes you realize that sometimes the most effective way to combat hate is to expose the hypocrisy of those who claim to represent it.
That's a really insightful point. The Klan's power in Indiana began to crumble when the true nature of their leader was exposed. And that's a lesson that's still relevant today. We need to hold those in positions of power accountable for their words and actions.
So it's about shining a light on the darkness, revealing the truth behind the rhetoric.
Precisely. And that's where journalism and independent media play such a vital role. They can help us see through the propaganda and understand the complex realities behind these issues.
Which brings us back to the New Yorker article, right? It's a great example of how investigative journalism can help us connect the dots between the past and the present. It's not just about telling a story. It's about revealing those unsettling parallels that we might otherwise miss.
And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so valuable. It's not just a history lesson. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to learn from the past and to use that knowledge to create a more just and equitable future.
Well said. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I think the most important takeaway is that we can't afford to be passive bystanders. We all have a role to play in combating hate and prejudice, both in our own lives and in the wider world.
I couldn't agree more. And I would encourage everyone listening to check out the full New Yorker article. It's a powerful and thought-provoking piece that offers a lot of insights into the history of the Klan and its relevance to our world today.
I second that. And as you read it, think about the parallels you see to events happening today. What lessons can we learn from the mistakes of the past? How can we use that knowledge to prevent similar movements from gaining power in the future? It's a conversation we all need to be having.
And remember, history doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes. It's up to us to recognize those rhymes and to change the tune.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And until next time, keep asking the tough questions.